All right. Thank you everyone for attending. We are going to go ahead and get started, and this is going to be a webinar focusing on wetland birds and then tales from the field, so all the birds that we see out in the field. Um, Before I get rolling too far, I want to talk about the setup and the outline of the webinar. So this is a Zoom webinar, so that means that we have some different tools that Zoom allows for us. One thing with the webinars is we can't see you guys and we can't hear you, so your mics and your videos will be off. But we do want to be able to hear from you. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the appropriate boxes in the settings. There's a Q&A button. That's where you put all your questions. And then there should be a chat box where if you have any other comments, you can enter those there. We do really like to hear questions, and we want to make sure it's a lot easier for us if you put the questions in the Q&A box. It's a lot easier than trying to read through all the chat when we're answering the questions at the end. So this webinar will be about an hour long. We've got about an hour long presentation, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, and we'll stick around as long as there are questions, given consideration. We're not going to answer questions for another half hour, but we'll answer any questions that come in. Okay, so for today, I will tell you who we are as MERBO, and then start with the scope and purpose of our wetland survey project. From there, I will introduce my co-panelists, who frankly are better birders than me, and they will discuss in depth some of the really cool groups of wetland birds we see. They will present, and then we will finish with a highlight from one of the best survey sites in more detail. And then lastly, we will answer questions and comments. So in our practice, it was about an hour for our presentation part, and we'll try to stick to that hour mark. Okay, so who we are as MERBO, we are the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Many of you already know that. We are a non-government organization that contributes to conservation of Missouri's birds through a strategic framework represented by these 4 eggs right here. These are quality habitats, feeding the flock, bird-friendly communities, and people in nature. So this project, the Wetland Surveys, has a little bit of all these components, but really it is, I'd say it fits most as an assessment of quality habitats. And then our presenters today, myself, I am Zeb Yoko. I am the Conservation Science Communicator. I will give this relatively brief overview of the project and pass it up to Eric Ost, who is our field crew leader. And then rounding out the presentation will be Matt Longabaugh, our field technician. He will have some of the best highlights. He's got some of the best photos of any of the wetland birds that I've ever seen. So it'll be really enjoyable. I hope you guys are looking forward to it as much as I am. Okay, so our wetland bird surveys. We survey properties across the entire state of Missouri. These properties are mostly private. There are some public lands, but these are all enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Easement Program, or specifically the Wetland Reserve Program. So these are investments through the NRCS and other organizations that help restore wetlands onto the landscape. And then we look to see that these investments are providing appropriate habitat, particularly for wetland birds in our case. And by look to see, I mean we go right to the site and survey thousands of acres annually. We've surveyed over almost 100,000 acres of land over the course of this project, with an average of about 33,000 acres every year. And so when I say by a look to see, we go right in there and survey all these sites, and we've covered tons of ground, and we cover it just like this. This is our director Ethan Duke modeling for us how we do our wetland surveys, and it's putting on our waders and grabbing our field gear and then going out there and walking through and seeing all the birds we can see. And also, I should make a note, it's all the birds we can see and all the birds we can hear, because a lot of these birds are secretive and you hear them before you can see them. Picture that Ethan was carrying a tablet, and that's because we put all of the birds we see, or more likely here, directly in this GIS software, which means there's no paper data sheets, which is really good in a wetland, and it's a lot easier for us if we just have one thing we have to enter the data with once. So wetland surveys start from April 1st in the Boot Heel area, or southeastern Missouri, and then they proceed from south to north, trying to keep up with migration. And actually, we try to do our properties, survey the properties in 2 rounds, and the second round ends by about mid-June. And because of the massive scope of all those properties, we don't hit every one every year, but we try to get to a good subset of them every year, and we get to those subsets twice. And several of the sites in this process we have surveyed during pre-restoration or at the very beginning stages. So we get to see them change over time, which is a really cool feature to see that these sites, as we do restoration, brings in more birds. And then some of these maps are available on our ArcGIS online webpage. Some of them are public facing, but a lot of the data, because it is private lands, we do have kind of locked down. But we'll be able to talk about a lot of the overview today. And then we try and come up with estimates of some of the densities of the number of birds that we see appropriate to each property. Okay, so over the course of this survey, we publish annual reports. So we started in 2014. It was our pilot year for this wetland survey protocol, and we've do six come out. We did do a short season in 2020 before travel was such a concern and was restricted. So we have a couple sites that we surveyed this year, but not nearly the scope of our normal ones. And these reports we publish and give to the landowners and the other conservation agencies, and some of the data we put in our annual report and is available to the public. So we've got a lot of cool stuff in the wetlands that we haven't been able to talk about too much, so we're looking forward to sharing it with you guys today. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Eric to talk about the first group of birds.
Thanks, Seb. And thanks everyone for spending the evening with us as we talk about our wetland project and the birds we see. It's such a treat, one of my favorite projects to be a part of. All right, so first to kind of, let me get this. There we go. You guys see that? Okay, so I snuck this in, Zeb. I wanted to show everyone some of the photos that we've taken, that I've taken in particular. These are all mine, and all the other photos that you see in the next slides that aren't cited are all from, you know, myself, Matt, Zeb, or other Merbo employees. But to kind of give you some background with these surveys, so, you know, as a wetland surveyor, our job is to be out there every single morning we can from April 1st to the end of June. And we're doing that to see what's using the habitat there during migration and then in breeding. So we have 2 rounds. And so our migration round typically runs from the 1st of April to mid-May, and then breeding from mid-May to the end of June. So the life of a surveyor, you know, a lot of us are just living out of our cars and camping at conservation areas or wherever we can, because a lot of these sites are, you know, out in the sticks, and we don't have this nice field house that I'm staying at right now. We don't have a lot of sites nearby this, or, you know, sometimes Dana and Ethan or Zeb can do some surveys from their house, but a lot of these sites you can't get access to, so you have to camp. So, you know, for 3 months, we're just living out of our car and camping. And so, you know, part of the job, not only just surveying, is, you know, we got to check out the next site for the next day and make sure we can get there, because there's always flood years and roads close or can be open one day, and then the morning of our survey we're getting out there and the road's flooded, and we got to think on our feet to try to get around that and get to our site. But so we survey every single morning we can when there's good weather. But then afterwards, you know, around 11 o'clock or so, you know, what do? We can't just stay at the campground all day. So we try to get out there and explore the other natural areas that Missouri has to offer. And so with this collage, I just wanted to highlight some of the cool sights and images we've been able to see while we're surveying. So, you know, at the top here, we have some great wetlands, and these ones are really high quality that host a huge diversity of species, some of which have our target species, rails and bitterns, that we'll get into in a little bit later. But, you know, when we start in early April, I have this photo here. It's not uncommon to have a snowstorm go through, and, you know, wading through this really icy cool water is quite different than late June when it's pushing 90 degrees and you're in your full waders, and you're not sure what's sweat and what's water at that point when you're walking around. But some other things that we've been seeing out there, which is that, you know, Matt has been a part of this past spring in particular. You know, we were going to different wildlife areas and flipping over logs and looking for spotted salamanders. There's Matt over here with the ribbon snake. You know, we were looking for morel mushrooms earlier this spring, and I managed to find a few. And Then, though, while we're walking through the wetland, some interesting sights to see and some hazards are you got your cottonmouth right here, and you can see how it's blended in real nice to the veg there on below. And you would be surprised, maybe not surprised, but when you're walking and you don't really think about looking for cottonmouths, and then your instinct kicks in and you jolt as you don't believe it how fast you move, but you just evade that snake as fast as you can instead of stepping on it. And there's a lot of these around, especially in the Boot Heel region, the southeast part of the state, and up the Mississippi floodplain area. But then some other cool sights we see a lot of snapping turtles. So we got this common snapping turtle, and at first I was thinking that it was just kind of elevated in the water. It must have been on some sort of mud mound or something, but it turns out that's another snapping turtle doing right down underneath it. So I caught him in the act. But then there's some cool other things we're seeing, like this baby bunny. We're just at the campground hanging out, and this baby bunny was just using my rain fly there, and little did he know there was a black rat snake that was kind of lurking around, but he got away fine. And then one of the things that we're doing out there too, while we're surveying and looking for birds, is we're also measuring these water control structures. So a lot of these wetlands are right up against a river or a floodplain or lake, and they have a tendency to get flooding, and that's what allows the wetland to fill up. But how do we control that? So they have these water control structures that kind of sit in between the wetland and the riparian area, and the landowners can control how much water flows out or in, depending on where they set these boards right here. But something I always do is I've opened these up because there's a lid on top typically to keep debris from in there. And I've opened these up a few times and seen some snakes or muskrats. And in this case, I think it's a red-eared slider down there trying to fight the current as the water's pushing through. But I just wanted to show you some cool pictures and highlights from I've taken and collected over the years. But now we'll get into some of the birds that we're seeing out there, and we'll start this off by highlighting the waterfowl. So a lot of you guys are probably familiar with waterfowl, and you think of wetlands and water, that's where ducks are going to be. And so we are seeing a lot of waterfowl, but we're not really seeing as many as we could if we started earlier in the year. But our target species, rails, bitterns, and their allies are really what we're focusing on. And so we'll kind of show you what we're seeing and why we're not seeing as many as some people would like, because a lot of these wetlands host a lot of ducks in the winter. And if we started our surveys earlier, we'd find a slew of ducks out there. So we just got some good birds here that some of them are taken from me and some from our entered our photo contest. So to kind of help break down ducks and why we're seeing what we're seeing, we have two main groupings of ducks. So you have your dabblers and your divers. Your divers, kind of like the larger depth pools where they can dive, and they really like to go for those tubers and microinvertebrates down deeper in the water, while your dabblers, they like to stay closer to the surface and sift through vegetation and other insects and invertebrates that might be closer to the surface. So here's your standard list of birds that you would see in Missouri, some of them more common than others. While out on the surveys, I always like to keep an eye out for these cinnamon teal, because they're more of a western species. They're common out west. I got this picture out in Utah, but I always keep an eye out because there's always a few of these that are sighted, and you never know when you're gonna stumble onto one. So I kind of went over the habitat preferences in terms of depth of water and kind of what their diet is a little bit. But these pictures on the right-hand side here really show a good representation of them utilizing the habitat that they prefer. So here we have some blue-winged teal, drake and hen, and you can see they're just kind of sifting. They move their bill back and forth, left and right, side to side as they're going through the water to pick out interesting things that they want to eat. And this ruddy duck, you can see there's a fair amount more ripples here. So you can imagine this is a deeper pool that it likes to dive down into. But to kind of give you some context in terms of range maps, I picked out this northern pintail. It's not pictured here. It was previous slides. There was one, and also on the beginning one Zeb had. But this is kind of like the typical range map, stereotypical range map that a lot of our ducks have. In Missouri, southern Missouri, where a lot of where some of the larger bodies won't freeze over, that's where these ducks like to congregate. And then along like the Mississippi floodplains. But then come migration and breeding, they skedaddle out of there and they head up into the prairie pothole region up here or in northern U.S. And that whole area up there, if you're not familiar, is kind of coined the duck factory. All right, so kind of show you what MERBA has been seeing out there in terms of detections. These are from all of our 6 years of surveys, and right out the bat, you can see blue-winged teal, like that one that was pictured, over 12,000 detections. And I'll get into a little more detail the next slide on why we're seeing this species in particular. But one thing to notice on here is all these species that we have, the bulk of the species that we're seeing are all those dabblers. So they're really liking those wetlands that are shallower and have more veg that's on close to the surface. And so, your teal, your goose, your geese, gadwalls, your teal, shoveler, wood duck, and then you have your divers right here, like your lesser scaup, hooded merganser, and even common merganser. There's got to be one in there. And so you can see that relative to these dabblers, they're just not that present on our wetland surveys. And to help illustrate why that is, not only is it habitat preference, but it's also migration timing. So what we have here are two graphs with frequency of birds based off of eBird checklist. So this is the citizen science where people can submit checklists of birds that they see and where they see it. So this is percentage of checklists with that species. And then on the x-axis, what we have are the whole year in increments of every week. So on the left-hand side here, this graph is the dabblers, and then the right hand are the divers. And like we mentioned earlier, we start our surveys right around here, April 1st. And when you look at these, the frequency of these birds detected, they've already passed their peak in Missouri, and they're all heading, they're all kind of leaving the state by the time we're getting there. So, if we started a month and a half earlier, we'd have a lot more ducks on our surveys. But one thing to note, look at blue-winged teal. Blue-winged teal peaks, mid April, and that's might be why we're really seeing blue-winged teal, a lot of blue-winged teal relative to other species. And then if you look over at the dabbler list, it's pretty similar, but they have their peak shifted even earlier. So their peak is about, what is that, like kind of mid March or even earlier for some, and our dabblers kind of they kind of peak closer to April 1st. So that could help explain why we're seeing what we're seeing out there, or when we're seeing it. All right, so now let's get into American and least bitterns. And so bitterns are one of our target species. And the reason why they're one of our target species is that there's not too much known about these guys, and we're learning more and more. And in part, it's because people have realized that you got to get really into the marsh to find these birds. And I mean, these pictures, I got these pictures. I'm surprised I did. This is, 1 in a million chance for me. I never have gotten these good looks. Also, these ones weren't taken in Missouri. I think this American bittern was taken in Florida at this wetland park where they are so acclimated to human presence. And then this least bittern was taken in around Green Bay, Wisconsin. But American bitterns are endangered in Missouri, so we're really trying to figure out what exactly do they like? What habitat do they like? What kind of micro ecosystem do they, micro habitats do they thrive in? Um, and these guys in particular are pretty hard to detect even audibly because they have a really low sounding call, and these low calls, these real guttural calls, they can kind of transmit for miles. um, and so it's the vibrations they really want, and those, and contrary to that, the um, birds that have more the higher pitched calls, that the sound waves don't travel as far. And I'm gonna do this. I know I talked to Matt and Zeb. I wasn't thinking about doing it, but I'm gonna give you guys a little taste of what we're hearing out there. And it's so hard for me to get a recording, so I'm just gonna do American Bittern myself. So you kind of start off like a so it's kind of like this unka chunk is how they describe that, and you can hear that, and it vibrates across the wetland. And even when I hear that, though, it's really hard to plot them accurately. So that's why we're walking through the wetland to also see if we can flush them up, because they tend to be kind of skittish. They'll stand straight up, with their heads raised, and sway with the reeds. And I've had it a dozen times where I'm 5 feet from it, or it should be visible, and I don't notice it until it flies away, and they're pretty big. All right, so let's move on. So bittern frequency in Missouri. Look at this, American bittern. They start showing up in Missouri April 1st. Is that a coincidence why we start our surveys? That our surveys start then? I think not. So American bitterns typically only migrate through Missouri. And maybe if we get to a right side, or find exactly what kind of habitat they like, or what's drawing them further north, you might be able to mimic that type of habitat and have some that breed here in Missouri. But these bitterns migrate from about the 1st of April until breeding season around the start of June, and then come back again in October, in a less the kind of contracted time span. And least bitterns here, they typically start showing up around the first week of May, and they stick around here throughout the whole breeding season. Granted, less numbers here because a lot of these least bitterns are moving through the state and going further up, because like that one I had in Wisconsin, they're just moving through, and then we'll be breeding elsewhere. But you can see that we have a fair amount that are still around here in the summer for least bitterns, but American bitterns are just moving through. And so that's why, in part, why we have our timing the way we do in our surveys. And kind of further highlight some the bittern frequencies, what we have here are 2 graphs, with one of them the migration round and breeding round, with American bittern, AMB is their alpha code, and least bittern, Lebby, is their alpha code. And you can see here, these are our detections from our 6 years. So we've had over 250 American bitterns detected in the migration round, and in the breeding round, 25. So it mimics that graph that I just showed you, which was the eBird sourced. And then you can see the difference in least bittern relative to American bittern in terms of their presence. So you have least bittern showing up. Some of them show up in our migration round, and same goes for American bittern. There's always early arrivals and late departures, and so there's always going to be a little bit of overlap between these. But you can see here, least bittern, the bulk of our detections are all in the breeding season there. And here's some good news here. This graph is showing our detections of bitterns over time. So, this orange, 2014, up until 2020 here, and you notice we only did the migration round, so we weren't able to get any least bitterns. You didn't detect any least bitterns this spring. But if you were to draw a line through here, that best fit showing a trend, I would, it's pretty easy to see that it's an upward trend of increasing bittern detections for both species. And so that's really great news and just awesome to see because some of these are pre-restoration wetlands that we're going to, and then over time, if we're doing repeat surveys, they keep getting more and more. It's just really heartening to see that they are making a comeback as a group, these bitterns. So, and in particular, one thing I wanted to say was, look at the amount of bitterns that we've had in 2020 already, and we only did a third of the season. We only completed a third of the sites. So if we were, on track to complete a normal season as usual, this could be pushing 100. So, anyways, what could have been is just wonder, but it's just good news overall. All right, that's it for my part. So I'm gonna send this off now to Zeb here.
All right. Thank you, Eric. And that was a great impersonation of a bittern. That was awesome. All right, and I'm going to share my screen again. So I've got a segment of the birds here that I think are actually some of the more obvious birds. But they are very similar to the bitterns in that they are large and they have a big pointy beak, and actually they're closely related, as are the ones I'm going to start with. So these are going to be the herons, bitterns, and other large birds. So Eric already did the bitterns, but the other group members of this family I'll be talking about. And Eric did a really good job of highlighting why we do these surveys when we do, and with covering these rare birds. So I'm going to bring it back to some of the more common birds that you guys may be familiar with as well, that we do see quite a bit of. And so this first one actually is going to be two species I'm going to talk about at the very beginning, are the great blue heron and the great egret. So the previous slide was one of these two, and it actually was the great blue heron, which is the one on the left here. And the great blue herons are slightly bigger than great egrets. They're about 4 feet tall with a 6-foot wingspan, whereas the great egrets are very similar in size, but slightly smaller. They're about 3 feet tall with a wingspan of 4 to 5 feet. So if you're seeing them in a pool together, it's going to be really hard to tell that size difference. But the main things you're going to see are, if the lighting is right, the color difference. I mean, if the lighting's like this first slide, you won't have a clue. But if the lighting's right, you can see the color difference between the two. And then also sometimes this shaggier appearance and this crest will point out that it's a great blue heron. Okay, and then so across our 6 years of surveys, these large birds are frequently seen on our sites. And they don't quite flock like ducks do, so they're not in the same numbers, but we do see them quite frequently, with great egrets actually being the largest number in this group, with 1,500 over the course of our surveys. And then great blue herons are not very far behind, especially compared to the other members of this family. They're at about 1,200 birds we've seen. Herons are obligate marsh birds that feed on frogs, fish, and other aquatic critters, so they really like these wet environments. And this graph shows what their detections are overall. And then what else do I have in my notes here? So this is, I don't think, Eric didn't say the numbers, but we've had like somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 detections over the course of them. So they're still a small percentage, but they're frequent birds on our surveys. So you probably all are pretty familiar with these two heron species. So I'm going to move on to some of the other herons that you may know or you may not know. And I'm going to start with next biggest in size are the night herons. So as I've mentioned before, I'm the conservation science communicator, which means I do some of the science and then some of the nerdy background work. And I think that leads into one of the cool nerdy facts I think is really cool about these night herons, and that's that their scientific name is Nycticorax, which is Latin for night raven, which is really cool. And it's just kind of funny because they're not ravens. They are definitely herons, but they look kind of raven-like in appearance, which is where they get that name from. So you can see this posture here. It's got that hunch and its shoulder, its neck hunched down into its shoulders really far, which looks kind of like a raven, but they're definitely herons. And then the other thing is that they are more nocturnal. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And you can see they do have actually a long neck like the other herons. They often just tuck it away like this picture here. And so on this slide, there's two different species that we see. We've got the black crowned night heron and the yellow crowned night heron. So they are also marsh birds. They're slightly stockier with shorter necks than the great blue heron and the great egret. And their distributions are a little bit different too. The black-crowned herons, which are on the right here, are globally wide. So they're spread across the globe, but they're uncommon basically everywhere. So you can see them kind of anywhere, but you won't see very many of them. And if they're not uncommon, they're really secretive. So we think there aren't that many of them, but they may just be really, really secretive. And then yellow-crowned night herons are common along the coast. That's the one on the left here. But they do extend all the way into Missouri as their range has expanded in the last 100 years. Their numbers are fewer the further north we go. So we do see some in the southern parts of our surveys more. And you can see also in this picture that both of these herons are perched on tree limbs, which leads to the next fact I'm going to talk about, and that's that herons build their nests in rookeries, or that's the name of the colony or the nesting structure that herons use. And so they have these big basically piles of sticks that they make their nests out of in these tree rows on the edge of wetlands. So one of our sites recently had 5 of these night herons detected, and that landowner has said in the past they've had upwards of 30 in some year because they've got a rookery right next to their wetland area. So these night herons are active night and day, fittingly to their name, and then their crayfish is one of their favorite foods, which is why you'll see them along the coast more, but they do make it up in the Missouri again. And then the yellow-crowned night herons, we've seen just a few more, of 27 across the years of our survey, with the black-crowned night herons at 22. So one of the things, too, that's important to note is these rookeries are in trees, often the lines just off our survey. So you may have seen we're walking through the wetland and following a line in our transect surveys. A lot of times, because these rookeries are big, heavy nests, they don't build them on just like the one tree snag that's in the middle of a flooded area. They'll use the tree rows that are adjacent to the survey. So they won't have them on our surveys, but they're often frequently seen around our areas. Because we want those more sturdy trees that aren't super flooded are more likely to keep the nests and the rookeries intact over the years. Okay, so now I've got the last group of herons, and these are the little herons, including the cattle egret, the little blue heron, and the green heron. And so these are even shorter and chunkier. These are spread across our surveys in different areas. The little blue herons are typically detected in the southern parts of the state again, but there also have been some detected in northwest Missouri. And then cattle egrets, we don't have a ton of on survey, but we do have a few sites that had them occasionally. And they are kind of mold breakers for herons, believe it or not. The cattle egret is also in upland areas like cattle pastures, and that's because they have a slightly different foraging strategy, fittingly enough to their name. And then green herons used to be called green-backed herons, which you can see here, the wings and the back of its head are green, but it's got a couple different colors on it too, which might be why they had a more specific name before, but they now just call them green herons. And so one of the notes about the green herons I think is really interesting is their legs are super bright orange, and like maybe it's just the light that I've seen them in, but they're like the brightest colored legs of any of the birds that I see on any of our surveys, really, especially out in the wetlands. Okay, so these guys, we've had pretty good numbers of them around our surveys. The green herons are the most common of the small herons at 164, and the little blue herons were, again, about 40. So because they're not as widespread across the state, we don't have as big of numbers. And then cattle egrets, I know we've had a couple, we've talked about this before, they may not have been on survey because they were either across from the wetland or just not quite where our survey lines were. So we've seen them, but we don't see them in our wetlands very often. And so I don't know if you saw it in the last picture. I guess the little blue heron for sure had it. But they do have the long necks still, but they do usually keep them tucked away. And this is a pretty typical posture for these little herons. And they tend to look chunky, and especially the green heron. And these are closer in reference. So you guys probably know what you probably know what the great blue heron looks like in size. These guys are more similar to crow size. So even though they're herons, they're a lot smaller than some of the other herons in the same family. If I remember from my surveys correctly, we saw them flying over a lot, and we don't count things that are flying over that are not using the habitat that we're into. That's another important point, because we want to make sure when we're doing our surveys of what's occurring in the wetland, it's something that's actively using the wetland that we are looking at. So we don't count all of the flyovers as often. And talking about flyovers leads into a perfect segue to the next bird I'm going to talk about, which is the American white pelican. And these guys, these are all white pelicans here in this photo. they are, I would describe them as shockingly graceful in the air, because you see them just effortlessly gliding up in the, riding the air currents like seen here. Like you can see that their wings are all pretty much still. They're not flapping a whole bunch, and they can just kind of float. And the reason I think it's shockingly for these species is they're big birds. They're large and graceful floaters, and they're typically found in deeper water because they are fish eaters. As you can see, they've got this very big beak, and then they've got this pouch. I think we talked about it in a Wacky Fact Wednesday. I don't remember for sure in our archives, but I know pelicans have a very interesting adaptation in this pouch that's attached to their beak. So again, they've got this big giant beak and this pouch, and they're just really big birds overall. So the fact that they can just float around in the air is shocking to me. So I actually, when I was doing the research for this, I was surprised. Their overall size is about 4 to 5 feet in length, and then their wingspan is 8 to 9 feet, which is even bigger than I thought. But it was, I saw it in several places. So, and it must, I mean, they have to be big just to stay up in the air with it, to carry that big body around. And again, they are mostly going to be in the deeper open water areas because they eat fish that they can catch in that part. And then the last bird I'm going to talk about, which is not closely related to anything so far, is these sandhill cranes. So sandhill cranes, though they look like great blue herons, they're actually more closely related to a group of birds that Matt's going to talk about in the rails. And sandhill cranes are really infrequent on our surveys. And I want to make a point too with these sandhill cranes are the only cranes. A lot of people call the herons cranes, but they're not cranes. Again, they're not even closely related, actually. Sandhill cranes are the only cranes you're going to see in Missouri. They use wetlands and large open fields. Historically, they were very common in Missouri, but their range and migration routes have shifted north, with western Nebraska being a huge stopover site for these birds. We have seen a couple breeding pairs and a couple, again, we've only seen 17 of the thousands of observations we have. We've only seen 17 of these guys on survey. But we do know from our friends and other contacts, and we have seen a couple ourselves, that there are some cranes that do breed across the state. We've heard at Los Bluffs, down at Swan Lake Wildlife Refuge, and then in southeast Missouri, we've also heard along the floodplain that there have been breeding populations. So sandhill cranes have this iconic red cap that you can kind of tell. And sometimes you'll see too, they have really large wings as well. Their wings fold up into what's called like a bustle, or like a kind of like a clump of feathers at the back. That's not actually a tail, it's their wings. And that's different than kind of the pointy edges that the herons have on their silhouettes. And then one other thing is the sandhill cranes, you can hear them for miles. Their call is, it's a loud trumpeting call that broadcasts, and it goes a very long way. And hopefully you can hear it when I play back the call here. Awesome. So you can also, it's just nice to hear the wetland in the background there too, with these trumpeting sandhill cranes. So they're a really cool bird that we get to see very rarely, but again, if they're in the area at all, you'll hear them, which is super cool too. Oop, and I'm playing. So the last thing about these sandhill cranes is their young are called colts, and you can see they've got this kind of rusty color here too. And so then this is that bustle I was describing, like their wings don't fold up quite as tight as some of the other birds, so that's another way you can ID them. Their young are called colts, which I think is really interesting, and I'm guessing it's just because they're super tall and leggy, kind of like a young horse, so that must be where they got the expression for that from. Cranes are opportunistic feeders. You can see them, I think this might be actually an ag field here that they're browsing in, but they'll eat anything that they can catch. So, I mean, I guess you don't catch seeds and tubers, but they do eat those. But snails, bugs, fish, frogs, anything that they can catch, they will eat as well. And then they use these beaks for probing in the soil, much like this colt is doing right here. Okay, so that's all I've got for now, and so I'm going to pass off controls to Matt, and he's going to talk about these guys' relatives, unless he snuck in another slide like Eric did before he gets to those. That should be up next, so take it away, Matt.
Okay. When we first started planning this webinar months ago, we had a little team meeting and decided who would get to present on which families of birds. And I scooped up rails. These is one of my favorite families of birds, absolutely. And I think part of the allure is because these are so secretive. This is one of our target groups. And rails, unlike most birds, are varying levels of nocturnal. So some of these are active almost strictly at night. So these two here, this is Sora and Virginia rail, are a little more willing to come out and vocalize and eat and move around kind of in the late morning. So these two here are far and away the rails we detect the most and are absolutely the most abundant. So they do have pretty strict habitat requirements. They have to have shallow water. They are of relatively low conservation concern. We'll see with kind of the next, the rest of the rails are much more imperiled. But we still would like to know as much about soars and Virginia rails as we can, just because they're so secretive and really poorly understood compared to most birds. So the Sora on top, he has this big old bill that he'll eat these little marsh seeds of some of this marsh vegetation. Virginia rail has a little longer bill that he'll pick at little bugs with. And since these are so secretive, most of our detections of rails are herd only. Once in a blue moon, rails will wander out in the open. I was very lucky to get these photos. Oops. Go back. Very lucky to get these photos of these guys. So usually we're hearing them rather than seeing them. So this is what we are listening for when I wade out into the middle of a marsh at 5 a.m. in the dark. This is what I'm hoping to hear. And so those soras also have this really abrupt whinny that they'll do too when they're agitated. Here is Virginia rail. So those Virginia rails have this kind of pig-like squeak. And so both of these will make that noise in response to one another. So often I'll be out on a survey and I'll hear a Sora whinny, and then it'll tick off a nearby Virginia rail that starts carrying on. And then the Virginia rail will cause three more Soras to start vocalizing, and all of a sudden, for about 30 seconds, this wetland just erupts in sound. It's really neat. Okay, so here's the rest of the rails. So these three here are even more secretive than Virginia rail and Sora. They're also much less abundant. So a little bit about the range of these. All three of these, king rail, yellow rail, and black rail here, are much more concentrated kind of on the coast. So the core of the king rail range is down in Florida. Black rails are much more abundant around the Gulf Coast. There's a ton of yellow rail kind of down in Louisiana. But what science as a collective is wanting to know is, what are these doing in the interior of the United States? Down along the coast where they're more abundant, they're much more easier to study. But these king rail and black rail have these really kind of messy, ill-defined pockets around the interior of the United States. And so we're just now kind of beginning to understand what these are doing doing in the interior. Yellow rail breeds up in Canada. So yellows we just get as migrants. All three of these will run before they fly, just like a quail. They'll kind of wait until the very, very last second to fly. So these again are usually herd only. There's a king rail. So this is a photo I took on a survey this spring. There's a king rail skulking back here in the reeds. So here's him. That work? Yeah, so I whipped out my tape recorder and recorded him. Nervous that I wasn't going to be able to get a recording, but that bird back there carried on for an hour and a half while I was tromping around the rest of this wetland. Okay, so here's some other kind of duck-like birds. Eric touched on pied-billed grebe earlier. We see quite a few of them. They like both little ponds and large lakes. So they'll be present at most of the large reservoirs, just kind of around the shore. American coot as well. We see quite a few of. That one we'll see on survey 15 or 20 on this little pond, but big reservoirs in Missouri in winter will have 10,000 plus American coots on a big raft out in the middle of the lake. And then there's this guy on the right is common gallinule, which are much less common. There might be a few in Missouri every year, but they look so similar to American coot, that body shape, that I'm just waiting for the day that I get one on a survey, just because they're really neat. They're much more timid, so they'll stay in cattails. They won't swim out in open water like coots and grebes will. I just like their little candy corn colored bill there. Shorebirds we see on quite a few surveys, and they are quite intimidating to a lot of people. Intimidating to me still a little bit. So on a nice wetland, we'll walk out, and this is what we see: just this total chaos of all these different species of similar-looking sandpipers probing around in the mud and shallow water. So I think what I and most birders probably do is break them up into little groups, just to make these a little more approachable and easy to kind of sort through. So first on survey, I'll pick out the big shorebirds and get them out of the way. Black-necked stilts we see quite a few of in southeast Missouri. We had a few on survey last spring. Willets, that guy on top here is an absolute monster. Those stick out like a sore thumb. American avocets are kind of in this group too. And then once you get those out of the way, you can kind of move on to the smaller sandpipers. Plovers stick out just because they're so kind of rotund. These little chunky nugget birds are easy to see just because their body shape is so round. Most folks are probably familiar with killdeer. This is semi-palmated plover here. Looks pretty similar. And then with those out of the way, you can focus on these two groups here, all the Tringa and Calidris species. So yellow legs, like this guy here, is one of the most common sandpipers that we see on survey for sure. And we'll see a few Calidris species. We see quite a few pectoral sandpipers and least sandpipers on survey. So the bulk of my time picking through a flock of shorebirds is in these two groups, is trying to identify the yellow legs and the littler guys, the Calidris. Definitely important to talk about prothonotary warbler. Prothonotary warblers are totally dependent on bottomland forest to survive, and they're declining as the bottomland forest disappears. They like it good and wet, so the deeper the water, the harder it is for raccoons to climb up the tree and eat their eggs out of the little holes that the warblers nest in. So we're definitely paying attention to prothonotary warblers when we're out surveying. And real quick, I know Eric had that picture of that cottonmouth in his slide. This is a wetland we surveyed in southeast Missouri. This water was maybe 18 inches deep, and there were like 8 baby cottonmouths swimming around in here when I did this survey. It was great. Other warblers we see, a lot of common yellowthroats and yellow warblers. These are definitely 2 of the most common. Northern parulas are common as well, but these are kind of a woodland bird. So on any given survey, we might have 20 yellowthroats, 20 yellow warblers, and then a parula or 2 kind of singing from the surrounding trees. Other warblers, there's 37-ish warblers that live at least part of the year in Missouri. And a lot of these wetlands we survey are surrounded by woodland. So while we are indeed focusing on the secretive marsh birds, the rails and the bitterns, it's good to have an ear out for what is singing in the surrounding woodland. So this is an ovenbird, top left here, which was surprisingly abundant in northeast Missouri last year. I was very pleasantly surprised to have several ovenbirds on a survey. Kentucky warbler here. This is a bay-breasted that Eric alleges he saw a couple of today. I'm not so sure. And then magnolia here. So this particular magnolia warbler was on a survey June 20th last year in kind of west central Missouri. And this is one of the latest records of magnolia warbler in Missouri of all time. So it certainly doesn't hurt to get data on some of these guys while we're out there too, because even some of these warbler detections may kind of help redefine what these guys are doing too. And every day there's an increased a chance that a bird that traditionally didn't breed in Missouri may move its range. Right now, black-bellied whistling ducks we're seeing more and more of, and then I've seen plenty of photos this year of black-bellied whistling ducks with ducklings in tow in Missouri. So good to take data on everything while we're out there. Wrens are present on most surveys too. We see a lot of sedge and marsh wrens. They have different habitat preferences. So this photo here was from a site this early 2020 that had both. So this had marsh wrens skulking around in the reeds here. There was some drier area just adjacent to it that was chock full of sedge wrens. Blackbirds, red-winged blackbirds are on every survey that we conduct, and they are abundant to the point where we don't pay much attention to them. We don't plot red-winged blackbirds just because if we did, we'd spend the entire morning plotting red-winged blackbirds. That being said, it is good to pay attention to other blackbird species. It's a real treat whenever we get to see yellow-headed blackbird. So you can see the range map down here. So you'll get them in kind of central Kansas, but they're not particularly common in Missouri. There's a few that breed up at Lost Bluffs, but we really don't get very many on survey. There are a couple sites that we've had in these past couple years. National Audubon said they have the worst song of any North American bird, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. Just listen to this. I love that. And then there's rusty blackbirds. So rusty blackbirds have had one of the steepest declines of any North American bird, and we're not super sure why. There's a former Merbo employee that's working on her master's down in Arkansas on the wintering ecology of rusty blackbirds. They're trying to figure out what's up with them. So we get a few of those on survey. This guy was from a site this spring. It was a real treat to see. And then I don't have them on here, but common grackles too are hurting. So we absolutely plot every common grackle while we're out and about. I know people hate to see them at their feeders, but golly, I like having them on wetland surveys. Okay, so just tying everything we've gone over into a kind of diversity lens. This is a site I had the pleasure of surveying this spring. This is a picture of one transect. So I had one line to walk right through the middle of this pool. And so this one pool of water had tons of shorebirds. So I had dunlin, plovers, several different types of sandpipers. It had ducks. So there are several species of ducks, pied-billed grebes, multiple American white pelicans, maybe 60-ish, great blue herons. This is the place that this rusty blackbird was hanging out at. We get warblers there singing from all the trees surrounding the pool. And this had 40-ish white-faced ibis, which we really don't get to see very often. So the ibis were great. But you'll notice they're all absent from the picture because this wetland also had these. This also happened to be great bald eagle habitat with all these ducks and all this open water. So there were multiple, I think I had 3 or 4 eagles this morning. It was great. Here's what my phone looked like at the end of this transect. So when I took this photo, I was standing up north here. And these are all just the little points. So I'll one by one, I'll put these little points where the birds are located. So all the mud and really shallow water was up here at the north end of the transect. So that's where all these sandpiper points are. See dunlin here, semi-palmated sandpiper. There's a flock of 400 of these up probing in the mud up here. A couple yellow legs. Kind of the top corner here, there was a little patch of kind of reedy cattails. So that's where we kind of got all of our more secretive marsh birds up there. I flushed an American bittern walking in, so that was this point up here. There was several sora whinnying there. I had a marsh wren just chitting away, ticked off at me that I disturbed them up there. Down south was all open water, so this is a lot of what you saw in that photo there. Flock of blue-winged teal, other ducks. There's northern shovelers, gadwall, barn swallows were picking off bugs off the surface of the water. Tree swallows here too. A lot of herons. There's great egrets here. Great egret down in the trees here. Great blue herons over here. Pelicans, Canada geese, pied-billed grebe scooting along the side over here in the water. And then everything singing from the trees. So you saw in that photo, this pool is surrounded by woodland. So there was northern cardinal up here, several common yellowthroats. This is where that rusty blackbird flock was here. It was 4 or 5 of those. And then everything else, song sparrows, yellow-rumped warbler, white-throated sparrow, brown-headed cowbird. So really just that this wetland was especially diverse. It's just a real treat to survey and to see the see such great habitat there. And after Eric put that slide together, I couldn't help but make one of my own. So like he said, after survey, we've got time to kill. This is a red-tailed hawk. You see one red tail feather there that I saw on the way home from a survey in North Missouri. I thought it was a snowy owl at first, but red-tailed hawk with a pigment deformity on a telephone pole. And last year was tough with all the flooding. It made sites tough to get into. There were several sites that were just totally inaccessible. But it did make for good wildlife viewing. So some of the gravel roads in southeast Missouri were inundated. So there were species like this black-necked stilt that I crawled up next to and took a photo of that were nesting on these gravel roads. It was really great to see. And while I was down here taking a picture of this, there were also some fulvous whistling ducks. That was one of the highlights of my survey season last year, was a flock of 5 fulvous whistling ducks down in southeast Missouri. And that was the first and only time I'd ever seen fulvous whistling ducks. And that's just one of the new birds that I have picked up over the last couple of years. So this guy here is a hooded warbler. And when I was driving from surveys in the Boot Heel to our field house in El Dorado Springs, I stopped in the Ozarks and got out of my car, and there was a hooded warbler and a cerulean warbler and a Swainson's warbler all singing within about 100 yards of each other. So I picked up 3 new birds that day in about a 15-minute stop in the Ozarks. Great day. This is one of the cottonmouths that was on the road after a survey in southeast Missouri. So I crawled up next to him and very carefully took a photo. This guy here is a western grebe that Eric and I found. Well, Eric found and let me look at after a survey here. I was at Shallow Sage Conservation Area by El Dorado Springs. After survey, we just went birding and went to Shallow Sage, and he leaned out of the car and saw this guy floating around. And this is a grasshopper sparrow. And so this was the bird last summer that put my total county ticks in Missouri above that of Kansas. So this individual grasshopper sparrow is what signified my Missouri birding, encompassing my Kansas birding, I suppose. So as the time of my life surveying. So Eric put together this little map of just some of the wetlands around Missouri, and feel free to jump in if you want, but we spend a ton of time at Mingo National Wildlife Refuge down here, and Duck Creek is gorgeous. And Shallow Sage is right by our field house down here in El Dorado Springs. So we're at Shallow Sage quite a bit too. Lost Bluffs. There's been a king rail, a really reliable king rail hanging out at Lost Bluffs this summer. So get up there to get your king rail. Snow geese at Lost Bluffs in the winter is also one of the most absurd wildlife spectacles I've ever seen in my life. So just watching a bald eagle fly over Lost Bluffs and flushing 1 million snow geese is one of the greatest wildlife spectacles I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight that we spend a lot of the time on these private wetlands and have really nice opportunities to see areas that a lot of people don't have opportunities to see. But I just want to put this list together just to show you guys that you can do the same thing and see the birds and hear the birds we're seeing all around the state, essentially. And so these are some of the big ones that I'm aware of. I'm sure these birds, sometimes you can find a bittern on the side of a road in a little ditch. And as it's migrating through. So, I mean, you always keep your eyes open. And like Ethan always says, where there's water, there's life. And so you always got to look out when there's water, could be some interesting critters there.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
all I
yeah,
got.
thank you everyone for attending. We're ready to take any more questions. It looks like we've had a couple already that Eric has been dutifully answering in the chat and then in the question and answer section. But we can answer any more as they come in live. And we can leave that map screen up for a little bit to give people a better idea of what the opportunities are for wetland viewing and getting your eyes on some of these birds that we are privileged to be able to see that are very secretive in a normal circumstance. So we had a couple questions that are already answered, and I had one that just came in now, and the question was asking, how fast do you walk when you're conducting your transects?
I can answer that one. So we try to keep it somewhat standardized in terms of consistency of how much time we're spent at each transect, but it depends. I mean, early in the morning, all the birds are a lot more active than later in the morning. So those earlier transects just tend to have a little bit more time spent on them because there's so many birds that are being collected and recorded. And every time we hear a bird or see a bird, it takes 10 seconds or so to try to input that into our phone, and also to try to decipher all the sounds that we're hearing, because it's a cacophony of sounds, and we're not just inputting their presence, we're trying to input their location too. So we have to figure out, okay, that sounds like it's 10 meters to my right, and then try to estimate that as best we can using our imagery on the phone to plot that as accurate as possible. So when there's a lot of activity, it takes a little bit longer. But overall, probably between like a half an hour and an hour on a transect. And we typically get through at most 6 transects. But sometimes, 4 transects is all you have time for because there's so many birds and you're just mentally fatigued after recording all that.
Yeah, so I'll chime in here too with that part, the last part you're leaving off with, Eric. When we do our surveys, and somebody just asked if we do night surveys. We don't do night surveys. We do our surveys from, well, I guess not nighttime, but sometimes right before sunrise. We're getting out there right around sunrise and then going till about 10 or 11 in the morning. We do that when the birds are most active. And again, some of these rails are more active at night, but there's still a lot of them are active around dawn. And that's when, in general, most birds are the most active. So we try and get our best shot at seeing what's going to actually be there. That's when we do our surveys. Excellent. So, and I don't want us to stall too long on talking about our survey methodology. I don't want to spill all of our secrets. Ethan might get mad at us if we tell everybody exactly how to do our surveys. And this question next is asking about how we get access to these private lands. Do you plan on collecting more private locations or mainly focus on public? So with the scope of our project, I'll answer a little bit here, and then I'll let you guys follow up on that if you would like. The scope of our project is assessing these lands that are enrolled in government contracts to do this wetland restoration. So we have an agreement with the funding agency, and then we talk to the landowners, of course, too, to make sure we have their permission to visit these sites. I think going forward, we will continue mostly with these private sites, but I can't speak to the fine details of our contracts and our contract negotiation. You guys have anything to add to that one?
I'd like to add that overall, I mean, some landowners are apprehensive to our presence, but we provide great reports like Zeb had showed at the beginning and really highlight what birds are using the habitat. And to a lot of these landowners that might be more focused on ducks or just don't have the same type of bird knowledge that we do, if they're not just walking through the wetland and knowing all the bird calls, it's really eye-opening to a lot of people, and it's pretty cherished by the landowners to have that data because it really shows a sense of, it instills maybe a sense of pride in that their wetlands providing such critical habitat for these birds that are in peril.
Yeah, most of these folks are really stoked. I have multiple people that email me asking for a list right after the survey's done, so they don't have to wait. They don't have to wait for the report to come in the mail to find out what was out there.
Excellent. Okay, and so since we are telling tales from the field, Paige asked the wonderful question that you always talk about when you're in field biology, which is, what are your favorite mishap stories when on survey? So, who wants to start?
Matt, you go ahead.
I gotta think of a good one here.
Right, I got one now. And so this one is, I have a few different ones, but I'll just tell the one that was the most perilous. And this one was actually from a bottomland survey down in the Boot Heel. And to get to that area, we had to use a kayak and cross a fast-flowing river. And then we were doing bottomland point counts while we're in the bottomland. So it's kind of, the water level kind of fluctuates. Sometimes it's sandy bottoms, and then it drops into water. And you're in these huge tupelo and cypress forests, and you got a lot of Perthonte warblers and all that. But so I finished those surveys, and I was coming back, and I thought I could drop in like I was on X Games into the river with my kayak, because there was not really a good way for me to get in. It was kind of a steep drop off, and I was kind of panning around looking for a better entrance, and I couldn't find one. So I got in my kayak, and I was like, I'll just scoot across and drop in, because I've watched enough X Games that I'm probably a pro by now. So I kind of drop in like I would skateboarding or something. I drop in, and the kayak just like heads straight in and rolls over, and then all of my stuff falls out, and my kayak's floating down this fast river, and I've got my waders, so it's pulling me down, and I'm fighting, and I lose a few things, and I somehow get out of it and swim after that kayak, and have to hold on to some branches and pull myself up with all that water and get on. And yeah, that was pretty. I got a lot of adrenaline going through me, because those waders are heavy and weigh you down in the water. And man, but I didn't have to shower that day, so it worked out.
I haven't had anything nearly that extreme. I feel like mine are all pretty boring. Flooded waders, near misses with snapping turtles. I have my DSLR camera in my backpack when I'm in 3.5 feet of water. Sometimes I'll trip or something, and it'll freak me out, or I'll drop the iPad and then fish it out of the water, like lightning reflexes, like snatch it right back out of the water. But yeah, that's about it. Nothing too crazy.
So I have been out in the field for these wetland surveys in the past. I didn't get to this year, but I hope to in the future. But the one thing, I also had a fording a river thing, but not nearly as dramatic as Eric's. So I'll go to my other story I was thinking of, which is where it was a team with myself and another survey technician that year. And we were doing these surveys. And a lot of times you park a car at one end and then you kind of meet in the middle somewhere. Well, where he parked the car, the road washed out from underneath where he parked. So just it was a gravel road, and then just where he's parked, all of a sudden his wheel was just floating in just nothing. And it was a little front wheel drive car. So it was just like, well, we're stuck. I got to call AAA, and hopefully you can kind of keep doing the surveys in the meantime. And so I'm like, okay, that's probably fine. It's just a little bit more of a slog in all these waders to get across the entire property, but totally fine. And then, the sky starts not getting brighter like it's supposed to as we're doing our surveys, but getting darker, and you start hearing thunder in the distance, and you're just like, oh no, what is about to happen? But AAA got there, and it really was just like tugging the car out a little bit, and then we were fine and got in the car. I don't think I even got too rained on or anything, but it turned out fine. But that was definitely like the big because we were also, I didn't clarify, as Eric did say, most of these surveys are in the middle of nowhere, and this one was, I think, southeast Missouri, so it was like a 40-minute ride for AAA to get there before we could get anything solved anyway. So but yeah, he managed to have cell service, which is the most important thing in that situation. I think he had to hike a little bit out of the wetland to find somewhere that had service to get AAA called and get us bailed out of there. Yeah, it's great stories from field biology. Okay, well, we better get back to the actual topic here instead of just waxing on about all these wonderful experiences. So one person asked if we take vegetation or water surveys to document the quality of the wetland as well. In short, yes. We don't do water quality, but we get kind of coarse measurements of water depth and, well, some of that stuff. We're working with partners too to get some of that. And then vegetation, we give coarse estimates of how much of it is emergent marsh, how much is flooded timber, and that sort of stuff as well. And I'm gonna, yeah, so that answers that one. And then how many surveyors do you have? I think this is a perfect question for our field crew leader, Eric, on, I guess you can answer per year or on average or in general.
Sure. So typically it's two surveyors, and then we all pitch in a little bit. We've had, in some, like 2017, we just had one, and then we all help in a lot more. And just like last year too, Matt was the sole wetland surveyor. He's the only one with that wetland surveyor position. And then we all help and pitch out where we can, depending on where we're based out of. So once the grasslands project starts up here in May, then I kind of do a little bit less wetland surveys. But during the first month of April, like Matt, myself, or another wetland technician are really grinding out those sites that month, and then Matt kind of does all the rest. And yeah, I think that's been the case for most.
Yep, sounds about right. Okay, and then another question, and this one also we're gonna yield to Eric. Somebody is asking if there is a call difference between the American bittern and the least bittern. If so, could you do a demonstration?
There definitely is a difference. I'm not as good at this one, but it's more like a. So that's the least bittern coo, and then they have like a. Oh, this is the coo. Like a real low pitched kind of bravado, and that low pitch just like carries across, so it's pretty hard to hear if there's a lot of other birds calling, but you can really tune into that low frequency, and I'm a little ashamed of that vocalization of mine, but I hope it entertains you.
I think you nailed it. I think that's great. Okay. I have
no reputation to hold.
Awesome. Okay, and so the last question that I have right now, because I did say that we weren't going to stick around for a half hour, and we're getting dangerously close to that, so I think I will cut it off after this one. And it is a pretty serious business question, and that is there a group that helps develop wetlands? In other words, take land that was abused and bring it back to supporting birds. And for example, this person lives next to a quarry that is trying to recover on its own. So does anybody want to cover that one? I can if you guys are. So I guess it does. I just want to make sure I'm not talking too much, but it does kind of fall into the intro for our project. And actually, I've worked with them before. So a lot of our wetlands are in these easements, which are a cost share program through the NRCS, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA, or the Department of Agriculture. I'm going to see how many acronyms I can throw at you before you guys get sick of them. But really, what happens is they have all these contracts and different ways to do habitat restoration. So they've got funding for, sometimes they have funding for pollinator plots. Sometimes, rarely, they have funding for these wetland reconstructions. And I say rarely because usually there's a lot of people that submit, and they do all this scoring and ranking to get out which properties they're going to restore. And sometimes they also have money available for repairing their restored ones already. So the main way you can get in contact with these organizations, again, the NRCS is the big one, and they're going to be in your county USDA office or your county FSA office. USDA and Farm Services, FSA, they usually share an office in the county, and they will be better able to let you know when they are enrolling and what kind of programs they can help you out with. There's also, of course, money from Ducks Unlimited, and in particular Ducks Unlimited for our area for wetlands. Delta Waterfowl, I believe, does them as well, but we don't do any of the actual finding out and rooting out contracts for how to get people to restore them. We strongly encourage people to do so. I guess if you're wanting to do small-scale restoration in planting native plants that are water tolerant, you could talk to our friends at the Missouri Prairie Foundation and their Grow Native initiative. But hopefully that's too much, but also helpful in the process. NRCS is the one that we go with. And then I guess I should also mention the Missouri Department of Conservation maintains a lot of these areas on our map here, and they are another source of funding for some of this stuff. So hopefully that answers all of it. And again, we will post this recording on our website. So if you have any questions, and if I talk too fast, or if anybody else, if you want to hear Eric's repeating his playbacks or his calls for these birds, you'll be able to see it on our website shortly. And I think with that, we will wrap it up and say see you guys next time, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again, everyone.
I'm the last one. Oh man. All right. See you guys. Thanks for sticking with us, and I'm so embarrassed. But that's all I do out in the field. Imitate rails and bitterns. See ya.